Hi, this is Adam Ballinger again. Welcome back. I'm going to show you a little bit about folding forward today and steadying your low back or your lumbar spine. That's usually the area from about the bottom of your ribs to about the top of your glutes or your buttocks. Just below that's the base of the spine where the sacrum is, and these kind of work together. Oftentimes when we take a yoga class or when we practice on our own, we round our low back a lot. And a lot of times that feels really good. There's a natural good feeling that comes from stretching. It has to do with some of your chemistry and some other things like that. So that can be a little bit deceiving. That it feels good, so it must be right. Unfortunately, over-rounding your low back repeatedly tends to denature its stability, and injuries can come from that. When we do a lot of yoga classes, we tend to round our low back even more and more when we fold forward rather than extending through it. If you look at these first few poses, you can see I'm trying not to round my low back much. This is the cat pose from cat-cow. And that's one of the big rounding poses, and this is the cow, and this is one of the big arching poses. I want to show you something right in between, where instead of rounding your low back a lot, I'm going to try to stabilize the low back and round a little bit more at the ribs. So here we go. Stabilize the low back and round a little bit more at the ribs. This does add a stretch and does pull through some of the connective tissue in the low back, but that stability in the low back that kept it from rounding is exactly what I'm talking about. Here in this pose, if you're limber, you'll probably overarch your low back, and if you're rigid on the yoga mat, you'll probably over-round your low back in the attempt to lift your leg. What I'm trying to exercise here is that the low back stays extra steady. Lifting the leg like this with the glutes and hamstrings also engages the low back muscles. So if you can lift the leg high without rounding the low back in this pose, it's incredible stability work on the yoga mat for your low back. All right. So I'm going to try to show you a little bit more here as we go on. This lunge as you step forward repeatedly oftentimes comes with a big round in the low back if you're not very limber in your hips and thighs and groins, and if you're not very strong in your low back, which rounds it. By the way, hi Molly. Thanks for turning the water off back there. In between poses, if you're working on your low back stuff, it's nice to come into all fours, steady your low back, put a little round in your upper, and then move in between your poses, back and forth. This is a challenging thing, and I'm going to show you a little bit more about what I'm talking about here. There's that round right in the low back. You might be able to see it if you follow my waistline. And this is really common with scooping your tailbone or just taking your lunge step forward. That each time, if you're not stable enough, you tend to round the low back rather than stabilizing it and putting a little bit of round in the upper. You might even be able to see how a stable low back with a little arch and a teeny round in the upper back rather than a constant back bending nature in the upper spine adds the perfect position for a long, steady lumbar spine. Without that long, steady lumbar spine, the upper back tends to collapse as well. Here's another version of it. We see this a lot. When you step forward into Uttanasana, you tend to drag the tailbone down and create a heavy stretch sensation in the low back. Instead, come up on something higher and try to add a little more flatness to your low back. Using a block makes this easier. Muscles should be used to make that low back a little flat, and then try to round the upper. If there aren't muscles steadying the low back when you go to round the upper spine, where it's natural to round in the thoracic spine, you'll tend to round more in the low back. So here's the attempt to steady the low back and a deep forward fold and add a little round to the upper spine. This takes a lot of muscle balance and coordination, which should be part of a yoga practice on the yoga mat. All right. So let's move through a little bit more, and I'll show you more about what I'm talking about. The rounding and the arching of the spine, when it's done with stability and through the entire spine, trying to equally distribute the curves that we do, should be a healthy thing. And it's possible to do some pretty full ranges of motion and still be safe. but you have to pay attention to the natural curves in the spine and where you arch the most. When you move through your different yoga poses, feel free to take a moment, check your spine, steady it once it's in a good position, and then to move in and out of your other yoga postures. This tends to help with the muscle balance and stability. Someone whose low back is more perpetually rounded, less muscularly integrated, will oftentimes have another collapse or another muscle imbalance, oftentimes in the front of the hips, around the hip flexors. So beginning to create that muscle balance in the low back, in the low spine, even if you can't bend or stretch very far, can be something that eventually leads to more muscular release or balance in the front of the hips. Here again, check your spine and then move. It takes a little more time when you're practicing the yoga poses to stop and pay attention like this, and to even get out your props. If your body isn't limber enough in the hips and spine and hamstrings and even the calves and your thighs, then getting the low back to move in the right direction will be almost impossible. So you make the poses more easy to get the spine in a better position. That's one of the reasons why we'll modify or use yoga blocks. Check this out. I hope it goes well for you.